Hey guys, so in this video, we're going to take a look at ECG interpretation. So this here is just a graphical representation of the electrical activities of the heart. All right. Now it's important to note that the electrical activity of the heart actually precedes the mechanical activity of the heart. So it is the electrical activity of the heart that makes the heart to contract and relax. All right. So we're going to look at different segments of this diagram and what they actually mean. All right, so this first part, which will have a straight line, is called the isoelectric line. At this point, the ventricles, the heart rather, is doing nothing. Isoelectric line. The heart is in a resting state. And the next that happens is a deflection. Now we have both the positive and negative deflection. A positive deflection is anything that goes up, while a negative deflection is anything that goes down. All right, so we have a positive deflection here. Now, this positive deflection is called the P wave. So this is called the P wave. Now, the P wave just signifies the contraction of the atrium. Okay, so this is just the electrical activity. This actually signifies depolarization. So when you have that depolarization at the SA node, right, you have this little bump, and that signifies that the atrium just contracted. Okay, now moving forward, the next deflection you have is actually a negative deflection. We have a negative deflection, a positive deflection, and a negative deflection. Now these deflections are called QRS complex. Okay, so you have the Q wave, negative deflection, the positive deflection, arrow wave, and the S wave. Together, they are called QRS complex. Now, what does the QRS complex stand for? This just represents the contraction of the ventricles. Now you can see that this is very big. Now this just shows that the ventricles obviously anatomically is bigger than the atrium. And so the activity of the ventricles will be more magnified in the EKG. Okay, now moving over to the next deflection, it's a positive one. Now this is called the T wave. T wave. Now what does the T wave stands for? The T wave just signifies the relaxation of the ventricles. Relaxation of the ventricles. Now, let's now take a look at important points. Now, the P wave, what do we say the P wave stands for? The P wave stands for atrial depolarization. So when the atrium depolarizes, the influx of calcium and sodium into the SA node, right, fires that action potential. That causes that depolarization. That's the bump you can see here. All right. Now, the next thing that follows is the QRS complex. What does this signify? This actually signifies ventricular depolarization. This is when the ventricles depolarize. So let's write that down. Ventricular depolarization. Ventricular depolarization. All right. Now, the T wave, what does it stand for? The T wave actually stands for ventricular repolarization because it's trying to repolarize, coming back to the normal resting potential. So let's name that ventricular repolarization now. All right, so these are important events that happens in the heart. Okay, now You may want to ask, but there is a repolarization of the ventricles. Why can't we see a repolarization of the atrium? Now, the answer is that the contraction or the ventricular depolarization is so large that it actually hides the atrial repolarization. And this is because the atrium doesn't really have to do a lot of uh, um, contraction for it to send blood to the ventricles. So when blood just fills the atrium, it moves down to the ventricle. It is the ventricle that pushes the blood. And so in actual fact, the atrium and the ventricular depolarization happens almost at the same time. And so because the ventricles are bigger, it covers that of the P wave, which is the atrial depolarization. Okay, so that's what happens here. Now, we're going to look at intervals now, important intervals. Now, there is this interval from the beginning of the P wave, this point, to the beginning of the Q wave. This interval is known as the P arrow interval. And this simply stands for the time, okay, the interval it will take the atrium to contract. All right, atrium to contract. Now we also have another interval, another important interval. Now that interval is the QT interval. It actually starts from the beginning of the Q. Okay, let's label that from here, here, and stops here, the end of the T. Now this represents, this actually, this is the QT interval. This stands for the interval of the contraction and relaxation of the ventricles. So between Q and T, you have the ventricles relaxing and contracting. We also have important interval, which I mentioned before, QRS-complex. It's just when the ventricles contract, the time taken for the ventricles to contract, depolarization. Okay, then this part represents repolarization. So this is what an EKG mean. Okay, so in my next video I'm going to be teaching you how to detect if there is a problem in any part using measurement. You know, there are little boxes, and those little boxes actually has their value. So if anyone is probably longer or higher or bigger, for example, if the QRS complex is wider, that means it is taking so much time for the ventricles to contract, and that could be a very serious problem. Okay, so this is what an EKG interpretation looks like. Thank you, and see you in my next video.